health advocacy service, moving people out of a long stay hospital. So I've been around for a very long time, seen lots of different changes. I recently took redundancy from Connected Voice to start up a consultancy. And so I'm now working with the advocacy sector and the community and voluntary sector, but particularly specialising in supporting the advocacy sector around equalities, leadership, development and coaching, and I'm doing some external supervision. So it's a really exciting time for me, and so I'm really pleased to be here and to share some of my thoughts on equality and diversity. So I'm going to share, there we go.
Beautiful, got it.
Got it? Is it up now?
Yeah, perfect.
Fabulous. Okay, so the title I chose is Are You Delivering on Equality and Social Justice? And I was thinking about this in terms of we often focus on whether other organisations are delivering on what they should be, but do we really spend enough time and looking internally and making sure that we kind of walk the walk, talk the talk as well as walk the walk with other organisations? So I wanted to look at whether we're delivering on equality and social justice, and really thinking about what can we do to take action, particularly to make sure that we're not just delivering on contracts. So we're not just, we haven't just become a service delivery organisation, kind of, you know, constantly kind of bidding for tenders and then delivering that work, but that we keep the core of what advocacy is about, which is about being a community action organisation, keeping its roots to the early days of advocacy. So I was thinking about this in terms of, do we need to make sure that we're still doing the right work with the right people for the right reasons? Okay, so I'm going to take you through kind of what I think are the steps in a journey around looking at this. So I want to talk a little bit about the case for delivering equality and social justice. And then I want to talk about how we make a start with that. And that's with commitment, assessing where you are, looking at an action plan, monitoring, and looking at systemic change. So I'm going to start with the case for putting anti-discrimination at the heart of planning and delivery. A lot of us will have missions and value statements that have been involved in, that we've worked with all our stakeholders, and that we're proud of, that they really kind of get to the heart of what our advocacy organisation is about. But those statements, you know, however smart and kind of aspirational they are, they do need to be reflected in practice. So that's a good reason for kind of putting it at the heart of what we do, not just kind of a statement, but in our planning and delivery of services. Most people will have signed up to the Advocacy Charter, and that kind of integral to that is promoting social inclusion, equality and social justice. And many of you will have achieved the quality performance mark, or you'll be working towards it. And in the quality performance mark, there is a real commitment to equality and diversity standards, and action taken to support anti-discriminatory practice. I'm hoping we will be kind of looking at those standards and kind of making sure they're still fit for purpose as time goes on. Another good reason is about your staff team. So we all know what it's like when we're short-staffed, and there's real evidence to suggest that if you pay attention to diversity and inclusion, not only do you get a really good range of people with really good skills in your team, but also staff are happier and they want to stay with you. So the retention is much better. You retain experienced staff who have a lot to give to the organisation. And then a kind of a dry reason is it helps with your funding applications. Often commissioners are looking for clear evidence of just demonstrating your commitment to equality. And then there's something called the public sector equality duty, and a lot of people might not know about this. If you get any funding from either the local authority or health, then you become a subcontractor of a public sector, and there are real legal duties in terms of equality that you must adhere to. There is a guide published by the Equality and Human Rights Commission that kind of outlines the duties of voluntary and community sector, so it's worth having a look at that. But also there's a moral duty about doing what needs to be done. Historically, sometimes we've fallen short, so you know, we've seen in some of the kind of incidences of Walton Hall and Winterbourne View that advocacy fell short in terms of delivering, and things like have we been delivering IMHA for people from all different communities? We know that there's been research to say that we haven't. But also, I think in terms of what's happening today, looking at what the issues are and broadly looking at how advocacy can contribute to the equality agenda. So looking at the Black Lives Matter campaigns, and also looking at COVID and what are we doing to support people who need to access food banks and COVID mutual aid groups, and looking at who is most affected by COVID, minoritized communities, those who are in poor housing, women experiencing domestic violence, autistic people whose routines have been changed, LGBT community who are suffering isolation, and particularly young trans people who may be forced to be living at home in a homophobic, transphobic environment. So it's looking at those kind of things as kind of current things change in the world. We should be making a contribution to that. So I'm now going to talk about your equality, diversity and inclusion journey. So obviously I know some of you might be thinking, well, I can't influence this, I'm not a senior manager. But I think we all can make a contribution to this, whether it's nudging our organisation in the right direction, whether it's getting together with colleagues who've got who come from a similar background or interest and talking about what your needs are and then feeding that up through the organisation. But essentially, the most important thing is that there is a commitment from the organisation, and that commitment needs to be about making lasting change, and it needs to come from the senior team and from trustees to lead this work, because it's important that those people who are affected by discrimination aren't just the people who are driving that. It involves having sometimes difficult but open and honest conversations with people in the organisation. Sometimes with people who think they're right on, but haven't pushed things far enough. It's also about active listening. So thinking about not just kind of listening kind of on the surface, but really actively thinking about what somebody's saying, what you can do about that, and really hearing what people have to say, even if that can be challenging, and learning from that as a result of open discussions. And also it's about learning together, and it doesn't always have to be a conflict situation. It's about learning together around anti-discriminatory practice and looking at training at all levels, and that might include admin workers, finance people, but also advocates and trustees. The most important thing is about assessing the readiness for change and finding a way to win over hearts and minds, because as we all know, well, particularly now there's so much change going on and people do hang on to things that they know, because we're all, you know, in very uncertain times. So it's finding ways to kind of really get the kind of push for changing as part of your starting point, really kind of everyone on board for that. And I would like to say advocacy organisations usually are already on their way on this journey, because, you know, we're not a construction company. Hopefully our core values and focus is on equality and rights. So, you know, we are some way there, but we do have to keep going along this journey. It's not something that you can finish and stop doing. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was, so once you've got a commitment, it's about planning. So you need some strategic planning and an action plan. So you need to identify what you need to do next, but it's also important to make a public commitment to when you've agreed what you're doing with a time scale, and that builds trust up with communities that you are agreeing to kind of make a change. So everyone's organisation plan will be different. It'll depend on your starting point. It'll depend what you've identified. Oh, sorry, I've just realised I've gone too far. There you go. An assessment. So you need to think about an assessment before you do your plan. Sorry. So you're looking at where you are now and what you want to be. You might want to do an equality audit. Now, for an equality audit, you could get an external person, either a local consultant, or you can do it from within the organisation and bring a steering group together. But that group of people will need to have some agency within the organisation. They'll need to be given time to do it properly, and they'll need to be able to have some control and power over the results of the audit. So the audit will identify work that needs to be done with all the protected characteristics under the Equality Act. So that may, and also there needs to be attention made to kind of the intersection between those protected characteristics and looking at people who are most disadvantaged and discriminated against. So for example, you might look at people who have mental health problems who have a disability, but you may be looking at people from the Afro-Caribbean community who are more likely to be sectioned and detained. And the other thing to do is to assess your policies and procedures through an equality lens, having a look to see if there's any unconscious bias or structural discrimination. And what I mean by that is our organisations are institutions. You know, although we came from a grassroots background, you know, in the 70s and 80s, we're now part of a system, and being part of a system affects our structure. And so, you know, we need to have a look at all the policies and procedures to make sure that we're not unintentionally discriminating against people. And that doesn't mean to say that there are individuals within the organisation who his behaviour is discriminatory. Of course, there may be, and that's something that you will need to tackle. But even if everyone is kind of benign and kind of neutral, our organisations are part of a system that is, historically has been run by a majority of people who will be white men, and therefore that becomes the norm. And so we need to look at it through that equality lens. And also we need to find out what happens in practice, not just on paper. And I know that from a kind of director perspective, sometimes you're thinking, oh, this is great, I've got a great policy on this, it works smoothly. And then maybe 6 months down the line, somebody comes to you and says, this has happened. And you say, yeah, but we've got a policy on that. And they look at you and you're like, oh, okay, well, I didn't embed that policy very well then. So it's about making sure that things happen in practice. And if they're not happening, to go back and look at what's wrong with the policy, because people do want to follow policies, I believe. It's just sometimes they're not fit for purpose. Right, okay, back on track to the, so you've done your assessment, whether that's through an external person like me, or you've got within your organisation to do that. So you're building up a picture of what you need to do, and you need to plan to do that. So as I said, every organisation's plan will be different. I can't give you an off-the-shelf plan to look at, because it depends what you've identified in your assessment. But I suppose some of the issues that might be included in there is some anti-discriminatory training for everyone, looking at unconscious bias, looking at, inclusive language, and how to have the confidence to take positive action within your organisation. I've already talked about recruitment and retention in terms of that's a really good reason why to deliver on equality. So kind of addressing the issues around, are you kind of diverse and reflect the communities that you serve, right through the organisation, and might be looking at your senior management and the equality pay gap, and also looking to see whether your practice is culturally competent and equitable. And so when I'm talking about being culturally competent, that's more than being aware of culture. It's about changing your practice so that you're meeting the needs of different cultures. So there is some learning in there about what different cultures needs, but it's also going further than that. And when I talk about equitable, I'm going further than equality. So I'm talking about you need to, if you treat everyone equally, then some people will still have advantage. So it's about looking at what you need to do to get a system where you're kind of supporting people to get to be a level playing field. So it's further than equality. And then a big part of what people might want to do is to make sure that the service itself feels safe. So that staff within the organisation and people who use the services feel welcome, feel safe, and they feel listened to and respected. And so that might involve making sure that you have support groups for staff team members who can join together around the different protected characteristics. It might also be getting service users who kind of can do that as well, and meet up in smaller groups and make sure that they're involved in the planning of this. And generally that people are represented within the organisation often makes people feel safer. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is monitoring. I think monitoring, although I know from working in an organisation. Everyone sighs when it's time to do monitoring. But it is an integral part of advocacy, because we need to know kind of that we're doing the right things. So I think it's worth looking at what you currently monitor, and with an eye to thinking, why do we do it this way? Is this just historical? But also if there's any missing areas in terms of equality and diversity, looking at what kind of information you need to deliver that. One of the things I think that's important to do is to train people about how to ask about equality and diversity. I've overheard advocates who haven't felt confident about that. And, you know, the conversation goes something like they feel really confident asking all the questions of a new person approaching the service about, you know, and then they get to the equality diversity section on the form and they say, I'm really sorry, our commissioners are asking us to kind of get this information. Would you mind, you know, you don't have to, but would you mind telling me what your sexuality is? I mean, are you heterosexual? And actually that has a really big impact in terms of visibility within the organisation. That gives a kind of message to people that your organisation isn't comfortable. So turning that around, doing some training on asking those questions in a positive way, you know, by saying something like, our organisation really values diversity, and we want to make sure that our services are appropriate and for all of the people who we serve. We'd really appreciate it if you could tell us about you know, your situation, so that we can make sure that we're delivering the service for you and for other people. What that says to a person who's from a minoritized community is, this organisation really values me. So it's really worth paying attention to that. I'm not saying that is without its challenges. You know, it can be challenging to ask some people about those situations, but it's really important, I think, to try and practice doing that in a positive way. We've talked about the recruitment and retention being important, but I think it's important to monitor that with volunteers and look to make sure that you're monitoring on all the protected characteristics, and that you can use that information as well. And a lot of people kind of focus on recruitment and retention, and they make sure that the monitoring's in the application forms, and that the way they do interviews is, you know, trying to not have an unconscious bias there. But service delivery is really important as well. And so looking at, is there equity in who accesses your services? So making sure that those people who are discriminated against more get access to the service. So it doesn't have to be equal across the service in terms of who's accessing it. It's about those who need it most, and those who need it most, often you need to work harder with to get them involved in the service in the first place. And then the other thing is about making sure that the monitoring information is collected in a way that you can use it to make a positive change. I'm going to talk about that next. So evidence is power. And so often organizations will kind of do their monitoring, phew, that's over, email sent off to the commissioners, let's get on with advocacy. And so I guess I'm putting forward the case for not just filing that information. A kind of structure needs to be set up in your organization that you use that information to identify your gaps. and to plan and prioritize and show progress around your action plans. So it needs to be your action plan needs to be a live document that the monitoring feeds into. So I think it's useful to produce those monitoring reports on service delivery as well as diversity of staff, and to let both internally and externally let people know what the results of those monitoring reports are. I think what you can do with your monitoring as well is to do some research around your local population. You can gather kind of more up-to-date information from the local authority in health, because you can't just rely on the last census, because it's like 10 years old now nearly. And then once you've got some research about what your demographics are, then you can use that and analyze, look at your statistics to match against your local population and see if that's represented in your teams and who you support as well. And as I said, feeding that into the Equality and Diversity Action Plan and using it to measure successes and to identify priorities and to improve on. And I would say if this is one area that I think advocacy needs to improve on more, is acting on the monitoring. Lastly, I want to talk about systemic change. I think we've talked about systemic advocacy for a while. So this is about making sure that the small wins that we have with individual people is kind of really important. But if we can look at trends of social injustice and use that kind of on the ground intelligence to make changes at a system level, then we have a much more kind of widespread, massive impact. So I think it's really important that advocacy organisations take time and put systems in place to gather evidence of injustice and discrimination, and especially emerging trends, and not only just gather that information, but to speak up publicly about it, so that we can influence local policy, that we can kind of talk to other advocacy organisations about, is this happening in your area? Is this something that we need to tackle nationally? And I think as well, it's important to be allies to people in your local community. So if they have identified kind of some issues around kind of discrimination, it's important that you become allies to them and support their campaigns and get involved, and that builds a relationship of trust and partnership up with local organisations, where you can kind of match with them and kind of be able to offer advocacy to communities that you haven't been able to before. So I suppose my last slide, I'm feeling a bit like we're not getting out as much, so I thought we could have a nice picture. So yeah, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey, and the journey of kind of going through the process of analysing whether you're delivering on equality kind of changes the culture within the organisation. So that's really important. And I think that's it from me. I've left some details about me that people can kind of contact me for further information if you want. That's it. So thank you very much.
Fabulous. Deborah, how are you doing? Do you need a moment? Okay. Thank you, Jacqui. That was incredible. And the chat is really interesting when you read it later. And people, I think, are reflecting deeply about what you've said and how kind of how we can take individual responsibility to be doing more of this. And your points have connected deeply with people. So over to questions. Are you happy for me to fire some?
Yeah, absolutely.
Any thoughts on the best way to recruit people to improve and increase diversity?
Okay, yeah. I think one of the ways is about, as I said, it was about looking at your local communities and making sure that you can represent those communities. So it's really important to look at your gaps, and then target those communities. So some of that doesn't happen overnight. You know, it's about developing relationships with those communities, looking at kind of, you know, organizations where you have a relationship with, where you can advertise. But also I think it's about demonstrating that you're an organization that delivers on diversity, because you know, it's a bit like a bad TripAdvisor review. People people ask about organizations. They want to know that it's kind of a place where they'll feel safe in. So I think it's important to look locally and to look at those organizations, make sure that you send recruitment information out, but also to kind of do that more informally, talk to people, say we've got jobs, you know, we're in a position where we want people who've got the right values, we can train people up, you know, and encourage people that it's an organisation that, you know, that they would want to join.
I always remember somebody saying to me, if you think about your advocacy service, are you embedded in your community or are you parachuted in?
Yeah. And
I thought that was a great way of cutting through all of this, you know. So, and if you're not embedded in your community, then what's kind of stopping that from happening, and those partnerships? Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, because that helps with recruitment, doesn't it?
And also, I think it's about taking risks. I always had the view that I wanted people with the right values coming into the organisation, because knowledge is something that you can support somebody with.
Yeah.
And values are harder to change. So, and also looking at, you know, trying to get as many people who've used services in the past. So, you know, looking at the value of what autistic people bring to the table, people with kind of a forensic history, and kind of taking those risks as well.
Yeah. And we've touched upon in other sessions, haven't we, about the importance and value of peer advocacy, and how lots of organisations feel that they can't offer peer advocacy because of the statutory contracts. So just to bang the drum that nothing in the Care Act, nothing in the Mental Health Act stops you from doing group advocacy as part of your formal statutory role.
I mean, when I worked at Connected Voice, one of the things that we did was peer advocacy, and then as those people became more confident, they became volunteers, and then we trained them up as IMHERs and they joined our team. So it kind of, you know, it flows really well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that acknowledges and respects the roots of advocacy a lot more, doesn't it? Yeah. Thanks, Jacqui. Really interesting question around unconscious bias training, and recent research kind of suggesting that it's not actually all positive, and that there are some concerns that it can, my understanding is it can kind of backfire in cementing stereotypical views, and that it doesn't actually lead to behavioural change. I think that's my understanding of the criticism. Any thoughts on the value of it?
I think in a way it doesn't really matter what model you use. I think, you know, there are good things and bad things about different models. I think for me, it's about getting that conversation going within the organisation and getting the culture within the organisation to be open, because I think within our organisations we have, we will always have people who have lots of knowledge and information, and who can kind of counteract some of the kind of majority views. So I think in a way the model is as a kind of a sidetrack, really. I think it's about how you work within the organisation to change.
Beautiful. And that's encouraging, because it's about the conversation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thanks, Jacqui. So a question: when reviewing our equality practices and monitoring, how do we ensure our processes and auditing are biasly calibrated and avoid giving a true assessment?
It's a tricky question, isn't it? I mean, are we really ever unbiased? I don't know. I think we have to have our best shot at it. And I suppose the question I would be saying is really kind of physically look at things through an equality lens. So, spending the time to think, practice by practice, does this have any implication for any of the groups that we work with, or any of the groups that we should be working with? Is this unintentional discrimination? Are we doing this because it's best for us and our systems, rather than what's best for the people who we serve? So it's really kind of really digging down to the detail, I think, is how to do it.
And they're hard questions that most of us are going to be really reluctant to consider, aren't we? We're going to have to get our brave big pants on to look at this, aren't we? Because these are deep.
And it's about acknowledging power. We're in powerful situations, and I suppose we all have, if you look at it from an intersectional point of view, there are very few people who don't kind of come from some minority community. So we can all relate to what it feels like to be in the minority and to be minoritized by other people. So it's kind of really getting kind of in touch with that from ourselves. And transferring that to the kind of service delivery. And I think it's really important to keep a hold of that, because we can get really driven by systems and particularly in the kind of contract culture in terms of what needs to be delivered. And I think also talking to commissioners is really important, and trying to kind of there are some really good commissioners out there, I have to say, who do kind of understand about quality over quantity, but everyone's under pressure in terms of delivery.
Thank you. Some comments coming through about bilingual advocates, and we heard yesterday from Jessica about deaf advocates and the need to provide access to deaf advocates because of cultural awareness and which leads me on to the sorry.
I mean, one of the things I would say is, I think as a sector, we can be rightly criticised by our lack of progress around accessibility. I mean, I was involved in 2009 around delivering race equality, and managed to campaign to get multilingual language leaflets about the Mental Health Act that weren't there. We did a big campaign, Department of Health kind of put a whole load of money in, and there are those leaflets. But advocacy organisations still haven't managed to do that around some of the statutory kind of rights. And that is, there's no excuse for that, particularly now when, in 2009, there wasn't the internet so much, so you had to print out loads of leaflets in different languages. I remember we had boxes of them. You don't need to do that now, because, you can print them off as and when. And it's the same with around deaf and deafened people. It's inexcusable in this day and age that people don't know how to book an interpreter.
Thank you. Question about, can you elaborate on cultural competency and how this is attained and recognised.
Okay. So I can specifically talk about cultural competency around the LGBT community because I was awarded a Winston Churchill Fellowship and I went to Australia and Canada to look at cultural competency. So basically, cultural competency is about going further than awareness around the issues, and it's about, so it's a kind of a deep training with your staff about what the cultural needs of particular groups are, and making sure that you kind of not only have an awareness, but you change your systems around that so that there's competence within the organisation in the systems as well as kind of in the staff's awareness.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, I'm just skimming the chat box. For questions. If there's any other questions, please do pop them to Jacqui in the Q&A. Kit's asked a question, but I think it's a bit rhetorical. He says a question needs to be asked about how as advocates are we being developed to meet such diversity, learning languages, understanding other cultures?
Yeah, I think that's important in terms of, so I think it's twofold, isn't it? It's about making sure that the people who can from communities can be skilled up to do advocacy. So you have people from the communities themselves having the skills to advocate, and whether that's kind of peer advocacy, kind of community advocacy, but also getting qualified as well. So it's coming from the perspective of those with lived experiences can advocate. But also, I think you're right, there are some issues around accessibility. So, you know, I've seen a lot of stuff online about, you know, I'm not saying that everyone can learn to be bilingual, because obviously my shopping Spanish and my level 1 British Sign Language doesn't cut it in a tribunal, for example. But kind of looking at those issues in terms of accessibility and how welcoming your organisation is, and whether, you know, whether you're able to just demonstrate that you've made some kind of attempt to think about people's needs, and then getting the systems right in terms of kind of cultural awareness and kind of getting bilingual advocates, getting kind of interpreters, getting your website and your offer out there that kind of makes sure that people kind of feel welcome and know that you're able to do that.
Yeah, lovely. Right. Oh, we've got a corker here. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. I think the biggest obstacle is.
So what are you responding to? I think have you read what Kit said? But
oh,
sorry, Deborah. Yes. So the question is, what are the biggest obstacles in Jacqui's experience to delivering equality and social justice?
I think the biggest obstacle is giving up power. So we have to acknowledge our privileges as organisations and as individuals, and that's difficult, and it takes you know, not only as organisations but individually, that takes some work to be able to look at that and to change our behaviours and our organisational behaviours. I think once that, you know, once we start on that journey, some of the kind of technical things about strategies and planning and monitoring kind of flows after that, but it's the changing of hearts and minds.
Thank you. Well, and thank you. That was so thoughtful and insightful, and somebody used the word wise earlier, so I will echo that.
Thank you.
Any last comments, Jacqui, before we finish?
I would just say that I'm full of hope for the advocacy sector. I think there's been a lot of stuff going on this year that has really shaken up our kind of, settling into providing statutory advocacy in a way that, maybe hasn't been helpful for the sector. So I am very hopeful that we will kind of continue to develop, and just to say thank you to everyone for getting involved, and I hope it kind of inspires you to make some change within your organisation.
Thank you.
Thank you.